She scratched his luxury car in the rain, panicked, broke. She left a sorry note and tried to run. What she didn't know, he was city's most feared mafia boss. And instead of revenge, he wanted her. The thunder cracked like a gunshot over Chicago, and Clara Vance knew this night was going to end badly. She just didn't know how badly. Rain hammered against her delivery bike helmet as she squinted at her phone's cracked screen. $347 in tips after 8 hours of racing through the storm. The math was brutal. She needed at least $50 tonight to avoid getting another threatening notice from her landlord. One more delivery, she whispered, her breath fogging inside her helmet. Just one more. The GPS led her into the warehouse district where street lights were more suggestion than reality. Her bike's headlight cut through the darkness like a dying flashlight, illuminating nothing but rain and shadows. The address seemed wrong. Who ordered pizza to a place like this? She turned into what looked like an alley, following the blue on her screen. The narrow passage was so dark she could barely see 3 feet ahead. Something felt wrong. But Clara had learned long ago that when you're broke, you don't get to trust your instincts. You just survive. That's when she saw it. A sleek black car materialized from the shadows like something from a nightmare, parked sideways, blocking half the alley. She yanked her handlebars hard right, but the rain had turned the asphalt into an ice rink. Her bike skidded sideways, and she heard the sickening scrape of metal against metal. The sound echoed through the alley like a scream. Clara's heart stopped. She stumbled off her bike, rushing to the car's side where a 3-inch scratch now marred the perfect black paint. Even in the dim light, she could tell this wasn't just any car. This was the kind of vehicle that cost more than most people's houses. "Oh God, oh God. Oh God," she muttered, pulling out her phone to use as a flashlight. The scratch looked even worse up close, cutting through what appeared to be a custom paint job. Her hands shook as she grabbed a napkin from her delivery bag and scribbled a note. "I'm so sorry. I'll pay for repairs. Please call me Clara." She added her number and tucked it under the windshield wiper. She was turning to leave when she heard footsteps echoing through the alley. Slow, deliberate, getting closer. Leaving so soon, the voice was smooth as whiskey and twice as dangerous. Clara spun around to face a man emerging from the shadows. Tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair and eyes that seemed to see right through her soul. His expensive suit looked completely out of place in the grimy alley, yet somehow he belonged to this darkness. Behind him, 3 other men in suits appeared from nowhere, blocking every possible escape route. "I left a note," Clara said, surprised her voice didn't shake. "I'll pay for the damage." The man walked toward his car with the confidence of someone who owned the world. He ran his fingers along the scratch like he was examining a wound, then looked at her with an expression she couldn't read. "Do you know what this is?" he asked, his voice carrying a hint of an accent. "New York, maybe?" An expensive mistake. A smile ghosted across his lips. "A 2023 Lamborghini Huracan Custom Everything. This scratch just cost you about 6 figures. The number hit her like a physical blow. 6 figures. She didn't have $600, let alone 6 figures. Her knees nearly buckled, but something inside her, the same stubborn streak that had gotten her through 3 jobs and college classes, kept her standing. "Then I guess I'll be paying it off for the rest of my life," she said, lifting her chin. "But I'll pay it." That's when something shifted in his eyes. The coldness flickered, replaced by something that looked almost like interest. "Most people who damage my property beg," he said, stepping closer. "Or run. You're doing neither. Begging won't fix your car and running won't solve my problem." He laughed. Actually laughed. And the sound was more unsettling than his anger would have been. "What's your name?" "Clara Vance." "I'm Julian Thorne." He said it like she should recognize it. And the way his men straightened at the name told her she probably should. "And you, Clara Vance, have just done something remarkable. Scratched your car. Survived it." His eyes never left hers. "You see, most people who cross me don't get to walk away and discuss payment plans. But you," he paused, studying her like she was a puzzle he wanted to solve. "You're different." Rain continued to pour around them, but Clara barely felt it anymore. Something in his tone made her skin crawl and her heart race at the same time. Different. How? You didn't grovel. You didn't cry. You looked me in the eye and told me you'd pay a debt that could destroy your entire life. He stepped even closer. Close enough that she could see the gold flecks in his dark eyes. That kind of fire is rare. Fire doesn't pay for car repairs. No, he agreed, his smile turning predatory. But it does something much more interesting. Before she could ask what he meant, he nodded to his men. Take her. Wait, what? Clara backed away, but there was nowhere to go. I said I'd pay for the car. Oh, you will? Julian said, walking back toward the shadows. But not with money. Strong hands grabbed her arms before she could run. She struggled, but it was like fighting against mountains. Let me go. You can't just miss Vance. Julian's voice cut through her panic like a blade. If you can scratch my car and survive, you belong to me now. The last thing she saw before they pulled a hood over her head was a smile. Cold, possessive, and somehow hungry. Then everything went dark and Clara realized her night had just gotten infinitely worse than she'd imagined. As they dragged her away, she heard him say to someone, "Take her to the mansion and make sure she's comfortable. She's going to be staying with us for a very long time." The thunder crashed again, but this time it sounded less like a warning and more like a door slamming shut on the life she used to know. Hours later, the harsh, freezing reality of the alley faded into a terrifying new luxury. Clara woke up on silk sheets. The realization hit her before she even opened her eyes. The fabric was too smooth, too expensive, nothing like the worn cotton sheets in her tiny studio apartment. Her head throbbed, and when she tried to move, every single muscle in her body screamed in protest. She bolted upright, her heart hammering as memories flooded back in a rushing tide. The dark alley, the horrifying scrape of metal, Julian Thorne and his predatory smile, the rough hood pulled over her head. The room around her was like something pulled straight out of a billionaire movie. Massive windows were draped in heavy curtains. Antique furniture that probably cost more than her entire college tuition filled the expansive space, and a stunning crystal chandelier threw prismatic light across the cream-colored walls. It was beautiful and utterly terrifying all at once. "You are awake." Clara spun toward the deep voice and found Julian leaning casually against the door frame, still dressed in that flawless suit despite whatever hour it was. He looked completely relaxed, like kidnapping college students was just another normal Tuesday for him. "Let me go," she said, her voice coming out much stronger than she actually felt right now. "Good morning to you too," he replied, stepping slowly into the room. In the harsh daylight streaming through the tall windows, she could finally see him more clearly. He possessed sharp cheekbones, eyes that seemed to catch and dissect every tiny detail, and a faint jagged scar that ran along his left temple. "How did you sleep?" "How did I?" She stared at him in pure disbelief, her chest heaving. "You kidnapped me. You cannot just lock me up like this." "I can do whatever I want, Clara." His voice was dangerously calm, devoid of any guilt. "Matter of fact, this is my world, and in my world I make the rules." She scrambled off the huge plush bed, putting as much physical distance between them as the bedroom allowed. "This is completely insane. You cannot keep me here over a car scratch. This is not about the car anymore." He moved closer, and she noticed he walked with the fluid and silent grace of an apex predator. "This is about you." "Me? You do not even know me." "I know enough." His dark eyes traveled over her face like he was methodically memorizing every feature. "I know you work 3 jobs to barely pay for school. I know your father left when you were 12 and your mother died 2 years ago. I know you are exactly 1 semester away from graduating with a degree in social work because you desperately want to help people." The warm blood drained rapidly from her face, leaving her cold and trembling. "How do you know all of that?" "I make it my business to know absolutely everything about people who interest me." He was close enough now that she could smell his subtle cologne. It smelled expensive, masculine, and terrifyingly dangerous. "And you, Clara Vance, interest me very much." Before she could formulate an angry response, a sharp knock echoed through the quiet room. "Come in," Julian called out without ever taking his dark eyes off her face. A man entered who was the absolute complete opposite of Julian and his controlled elegance. He was tall, heavily muscled, with cold blue eyes and a hardened face that looked like it had survived way too many violent street fights. He glanced at Clara with open and raw disgust. "This is Silas, my right-hand man," Julian said cleanly. "Silas, meet Clara." Silas twisted his scarred lips into something that might have been a polite smile on anyone else, but looked like a lethal threat on him. The girl who scratched the boss's car, his voice was gravelly and low. "You are causing quite a stir around here." "Silas thinks you are a liability," Julian said conversationally, as if discussing the weather. "He believes I should have handled this little situation differently." The way Silas shifted his large hand toward the inside of his tailored jacket made it explicitly clear what differently meant. Clara felt her knees go weak, but she stubbornly forced herself to stand tall and maintain eye contact. "But I told him," Julian continued, his tone softening just a fraction, "that you are under my personal protection now. Aren't you, Clara?" It was not really a question, it was a heavy chain disguised as a statement. "I want to go home," she whispered, her throat tight. "This is your home now." Julian's tone remained gentle, but there was an unbreakable steel humming underneath every single word. "You are safe here, but you are not free. Do you understand the difference?" Safe from what, she desperately wondered, as Julian and Silas exchanged a dark, knowing look that made her stomach drop to the floor. "From people who would use you to hurt me," Julian said finally, as if easily reading her mind. "The moment you entered my world, you became a high-value target." "I did not enter your world, I scratched your car by accident," she pleaded with a rising panic. "Accidents have consequences." He reached out and gently touched her pale cheek, and she was horrified by the undeniable way her skin tingled hot at the firm contact. "Sometimes beautiful ones." She jerked away from his touch, her breath hitching wildly. "You are insane." "Probably," he smiled, and for a fleeting, disarming moment, he looked almost boyish. "Someone will bring you breakfast soon. I highly suggest you eat. You will need your strength." "For what?" she demanded. "For adjusting to your new life." He headed toward the heavy wooden door, Silas following closely behind him. "Oh, and Clara, do not try to leave. For your own safety." The heavy door closed with a soft, ominous click, and she heard the unmistakable and heavy sound of a deadbolt turning, sealing her fate inside the beautiful cage. Clara ran frantically to the massive windows the very second the deadbolt clicked into place, aggressively pushing aside the heavy velvet curtains. The sweeping view outside took her breath away, but not in a good way. Acres of meticulously manicured gardens stretched out beneath a gray Chicago sky, all tightly surrounded by imposing stone walls topped with glistening razor wire. She was 3 stories up with absolutely no fire escape in sight, and the sheer drop to the stone patio below would be instantly fatal. But as she desperately studied the sprawling grounds for any potential weakness in the perimeter, something else entirely caught her panicked attention. A sleek black sport utility vehicle was parked idling just outside the main iron gate, and another identical vehicle sat, perfectly still directly across the street. Heavily built men in dark clothing stood casually near the idling cars, their eyes fixed on the massive estate with the cold and terrifying patience of hungry hunters. Her blood ran absolutely cold in her veins. Julian had just told her that she was a target now. Were those silent watchers his ruthless enemies? A soft knock on the heavy wooden door suddenly interrupted her spiraling thoughts. "Miss Vance," a woman called out, her voice gentle and soothing. "I have your breakfast ready for you." A middle-aged woman entered the room carrying an ornate silver tray laden with fresh food. She had kind, sympathetic eyes and deep worry lines etched around the corners of her mouth. "I am Martha," the woman said softly, carefully setting the heavy silver tray down on a small elegant table near the window. "I manage the household staff here." Clara did not even look at the food. Instead, she rushed across the room and desperately grabbed the older woman by the hands. "Martha, please listen to me. You have to help me get out of here. I do not belong in this place." Martha looked down at their joined hands, her expression growing infinitely sad. "Child, I truly wish I could, but Mr. Thorne," When he finally decides on something, that is exactly how it is. The very best thing you can do right now is just try to understand him. Clara stepped back, her voice raising in utter disbelief. Understand him? The man kidnapped me off the street. He also saved your life, Martha said quietly, her voice barely above a harsh whisper. Those men parked outside the gates. They have been watching the house for 2 days straight. If you are still living alone in your tiny apartment, the older woman shuddered visibly. Mr. Thorne has many dangerous enemies, child. Very dangerous ones. After Martha slipped quietly out of the room, Clara sank slowly onto the edge of the lavish bed, her mind racing out of control. 2 days. She had been completely unconscious for 2 whole days. And there were armed men actively watching the estate right now, dangerous men who apparently wanted to hurt her just to get to Julian. She thought agonizingly about her small, cramped apartment, her exhausting pizza delivery job, her totally normal life that now felt like it belonged to someone else entirely. Then she looked around the luxurious, suffocating prison where she had apparently become a helpless pawn in some deadly mob game she did not even begin to understand. One thing was absolutely certain in her mind: she had to find a way out of this nightmare before it got her killed. Over the next 3 days, Clara slowly discovered that being a permanent prisoner in a gilded cage possessed its own unique and insidious form of psychological torture. The sheer luxury of her surroundings quickly began to feel violently suffocating. She tried absolutely everything she could think of to escape. She attempted picking the heavy bedroom lock with a hairpin, only to discover the entire mechanism was electronic and impenetrable. She tried breaking the massive windows with a heavy brass lamp, but the thick bulletproof glass merely absorbed the heavy blows without leaving a single scratch. She even spent hours contemplating attempting to scale down the thick green ivy clinging to the stone walls outside her window, but a single slip on the 3-story drop would have certainly killed her on impact. Every single desperate escape route she plotted led back to the exact same depressing conclusion. She was not leaving this estate unless Julian Thorne specifically wanted her to leave. But what bothered her far more than the physical captivity itself was the terrifying way her own body betrayed her whenever her captor was anywhere near. It was the way her heart involuntarily raced when Julian brought her dinner personally every evening, his dark eyes never leaving her face. Or how her skin burned with intense, lingering heat when his long fingers accidentally brushed against hers while handing over a glass of water. It was totally sick, completely twisted, and entirely against absolutely everything she believed in and stood for. She was pacing the length of her room on the 3rd evening, feeling like a trapped animal, when she heard the faint, muffled sound of angry voices drifting up from the grand hallway below. One voice was undeniably Julian, cool and dangerously composed, and the other loud voice belonged to Silas, his tone dripping with open contempt. She pressed her ear tightly against the heavy wood of her door, desperately straining to listen to the men arguing about the unseen threats gathering just outside their walls, completely unaware that her presence in the house was about to ignite a massive war. Across the city, inside a towering glass penthouse that rivaled Julian Thorne's massive estate in sheer luxury, but vastly surpassed it in ruthless coldness, Marcus Sterling silently studied the glossy surveillance photographs spread out across his black marble desk. Each grainy image showed the exact same disturbing thing: Julian's heavily guarded compound and a young woman with dark hair barely visible through an upstairs bedroom window. "Are you absolutely certain it is her?" Marcus asked, his voice carrying the faint, raspy wheeze of a lifelong smoker. Unlike Julian's refined appearance, Marcus looked exactly like what he truly was, a brutal street fighter who had clawed his bloody way to the very top of the Chicago underworld through pure savagery and relentless cunning. Deep scars marked his thick hands, and his nose had been violently broken so many times it sat permanently crooked on his weathered face. "Positive, boss," his top lieutenant replied, pointing a thick finger to the clearest photograph. Clara Vance, 22 years old, a struggling college student, absolutely nobody special. But Thorne has her locked up tighter than a federal vault. Marcus let out a harsh laugh that sounded exactly like broken glass grinding against stone. "Nobody special, huh?" He picked up one of the glossy photos, intensely studying Clara's pale face. Then why in the hell is the great, untouchable Julian Thorne acting like a lovesick fool? For 15 long years, Marcus had been impatiently waiting for this exact moment, waiting for Julian to finally show a crack of weakness. Their rival crime families had been engaged in a bloody, unforgiving war since their father's generation, a brutal feud over territory and street respect that had cost both sides countless lives and millions of dollars. But Julian had always remained completely untouchable, perfectly protected by his cold, calculating intelligence and the fierce loyalty of his lethal men. Until right now. This random delivery girl changes absolutely everything, Marcus continued, setting the photograph down with deliberate care. For the very first time in his miserable life, Julian Thorne actually has something he cannot bear to lose. When his lieutenant asked what the next move should be, Marcus stood up and walked slowly to the massive floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a sweeping panoramic view of the glittering Chicago skyline. Somewhere out there in the dark, Julian was probably planning his next offensive move, unaware that his greatest weakness was already fully exposed to the wolves. "We are going to take her," Marcus said simply, his dark eyes gleaming with malicious satisfaction. "And when we finally do, Julian will come running blindly into the trap. That is exactly when we end this bloody war once and for all. It will not be easy because he has tripled his estate security since she arrived, but every single fortress has a hidden weakness. We just need to find his." Meanwhile, back at the heavily fortified estate, Clara remained perfectly still by her bedroom door, her ear pressed tightly against the thick wood as heated voices drifted up the grand staircase. "Surveillance footage from 3 separate locations confirms it," Silas was saying, his heavy boots pacing the marble floor below. "Marcus's men have been actively watching us for days." Julian's voice replied, sounding ice-cold and completely unbothered. "Let them watch. They will not get close enough to matter." "Boss, with all due respect, this is not just about them getting close," Silas fired back, his open contempt echoing clearly even through the heavy bedroom door. "This is about her. This girl has made you completely soft. Every single crime family in Chicago can clearly see it." "Watch your tone, Silas," Julian warned, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "Someone has to say it," Silas stubbornly continued. "You have literally turned this entire operation into a paranoid fortress over some random college girl who scratched your car. Marcus is already putting the word out on the streets. He says you have finally found something worth dying for." There was a long, suffocating pause that made the blood in Clara's veins run absolutely cold. "Maybe I have," Julian finally said, his words dropping like heavy stones in the quiet house. "Double the guard rotations immediately. I want fresh eyes on every single approach to this property. And Silas, listen to me very carefully. If anything at all happens to her, I will hold you personally responsible. And if this brewing war costs us absolutely everything, if Marcus uses her to destroy the empire we have built, then that is my choice to make." Heavy footsteps echoed down the hallway, moving swiftly away from her door. Clara stumbled backward, her hands shaking violently as the horrifying truth crashed down upon her shoulders. A war. She was single-handedly causing a massive, bloody turf war between 2 ruthless crime families, and innocent people were going to die simply because she had accidentally ruined a custom paint job. The crushing weight of it hit her fragile body like a physical blow. She sank onto the edge of the large plush bed, burying her tear-stained face in her trembling hands. How many people would get hurt because of her? How many families would lose their fathers, sons, and brothers to the upcoming violence? An hour later, Julian quietly appeared in her open doorway carrying a silver tray with her dinner. He looked incredibly tired, with deep stress lines etched around his dark eyes that had certainly not been there before. "You look pale," he observed softly, setting the heavy tray on the small table near the window. "Martha made your favorite meal." "How do you know what my favorite meal is?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I make it my business to know," he replied, sitting gracefully across from her, studying her anxious face with those intense eyes. "What is wrong, Clara?" For a brief second, she strongly considered lying to him, but the consuming guilt was already eating her alive. "I heard you talking to Silas," she said quietly, unable to meet his gaze. I heard you talking about Marcus Sterling and about the upcoming war. Julian's flawless expression did not change a single fraction, but something dark flickered deep within his eyes. What exactly did you hear? Enough. She stood up quickly, pacing frantically over to the large bulletproof window. People are going to get severely hurt because of me, Julian. Because you stubbornly refuse to let me go. People get hurt in my world regardless, he said, his deep voice carefully neutral. This current situation changes absolutely nothing. Liar, she whirled around to face him, her eyes flashing with desperate fury. Silas is completely right, is he not? I have made you weak. I have made you vulnerable to your enemies. Julian remained perfectly silent for a very long moment, the heavy tension in the room thick enough to cut with a knife. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer and more unguarded than she had ever heard it before. You have made me human, he confessed quietly. For the very first time in my entire life, I finally have something I cannot bear to lose. The raw confession hung heavy between them like a loaded gun. Clara stared at him, seeing not the cold Mafia boss who had ruthlessly kidnapped her, but a broken man who looked incredibly lost and completely out of his depth. Then please let me go, she whispered, her voice breaking. End this madness before someone dies. I cannot. He stood up slowly, moving toward her with that lethal, predatory grace. I will not let you go, even if it destroys both of us. His large hand gently cupped her pale cheek, his thumb brushing slowly across her soft skin with a devastating gentleness. Even then, as he turned and quietly left her alone with her suffocating guilt and her growing, unwanted feelings, Clara realized the horrifying truth that terrified her the most. She was actually starting to truly understand him, and even worse, she was starting to deeply care what happened to him too. The desperate plan came to Clara at 3 a.m. while she lay staring at the dark ceiling, completely unable to sleep for the 3rd night in a row. She knew she could not stop the brewing war between the rival crime families, but she could permanently remove herself from the deadly equation. If she was no longer in the house, Marcus Sterling would have absolutely no leverage over Julian. Innocent people would stop dying simply because she existed. It was the kind housekeeper Marta who ultimately made the dangerous escape possible. You look incredibly tired, child, the older woman observed the very next morning as she brought in the breakfast tray. Her kind eyes were filled to the brim with genuine worry. This violent life, it is definitely not meant for someone like you. Clara looked at her carefully, her heart hammering against her ribs. Martha, she began in a hushed whisper. If someone desperately wanted to leave this place, hypothetically speaking, how exactly would they do it? Martha went pale, her hands shaking as she set down the silver tray. Miss Clara, you cannot possibly be thinking about running. People are going to die because of me, Martha. I heard Julian and Silas talking about a massive war. How many innocent families will lose someone just because I am locked in this room? Martha stared at her with deeply conflicted eyes for a long moment. Mr. Thorne, he is not a bad man in his core. But his dark world, it fiercely consumes absolutely everything it touches. Then please help me leave before it consumes me too, Clara pleaded, reaching out to grasp the older woman by the hands. I am begging you. Martha sighed heavily, tears pooling in her eyes. The industrial laundry truck comes every single Tuesday at exactly 2 in the afternoon. The estate guards barely check the cargo area because it has been the exact same driver for 5 years. But child, if you are caught, Mr. Thorne will be absolutely furious, and not just at you, but at everyone who let this betrayal happen. Clara squeezed her hands tightly. Then make sure you are not working when it happens. Take the entire afternoon off and go visit your family. Tuesday arrived with a massive gray storm aggressively threatening on the dark horizon. Clara spent the entire morning acting as normal as possible, quietly eating her breakfast, reading a book in the expansive library, and even engaging in polite conversation when Julian stopped by briefly to check on her. She secretly hated how easily the lies came to her lips, how surprisingly natural it felt to smile at him while actively planning her grand escape. At 1:45 in the afternoon, she finally made her move. The grand hallways were much quieter than usual, as Martha had apparently convinced several other staff members to take their lunch breaks early. Clara slipped silently from her bedroom and made her way quickly toward the narrow service corridors she had carefully memorized during her tense captivity. Her pulse pounded furiously in her ears as she reached the large laundry room. Peeking through the small square window of the service door, she could see the massive white truck idling at the delivery entrance. The burly driver, a man who looked to be in his 50s, was already busy unloading large stacks of fresh linens. Clara waited agonizingly in the shadows until he disappeared deep inside the house. Then she slipped quietly out the back door and climbed swiftly into the dark cargo hold of the truck. She buried herself deep under a massive pile of dirty sheets, the harsh chemical smell of industrial detergent burning her nose and throat. The minutes felt like endless hours as she lay perfectly still, listening to heavy boxes being loaded all around her. Finally, the engine roared to life. The heavy truck rolled forward, the tires crunching against the gravel driveway, and Clara allowed herself a fleeting moment of pure hope. She was actually doing it. She was escaping the gilded cage. In 20 minutes, she would be far enough away to run to a police station and disappear safely back into her normal, boring life. But then the truck violently slammed on its brakes, throwing her forward in the darkness. Angry, urgent voices erupted outside the metal walls. The back doors suddenly flew open, harsh daylight blinding her as rough hands reached in and violently tore away the dirty sheets covering her trembling body. Well, a voice said, incredibly gravelly and dripping with cold malice. Look exactly what we have found hiding here. Clara found herself staring directly into the deeply scarred face of Marcus Sterling. Standing closely behind him were 4 heavily armed men with their weapons drawn, all wearing matching expressions of predatory satisfaction. Clara Vance, Marcus sneered, hauling her aggressively from the back of the truck by her arm. Julian's little pet bird. You just made this entire war very easy for us. Pure terror flooded through her veins like ice water. I do not know what you want from me, she choked out, struggling against his iron grip. Oh, I think you know exactly what I want, Marcus laughed cruelly, his grip on her arm painful enough to leave deep purple bruises. You are going to help me send a very loud and final message to your obsessed boyfriend. They were dragging her ruthlessly toward a waiting black sport utility vehicle when the deafening sound of automatic gunfire suddenly erupted from all 3 directions at once, completely shattering the quiet afternoon and turning her desperate escape into a deadly bloodbath. Julian's heavily armed men seemingly materialized from behind parked cars, dilapidated brick buildings, and the deep shadows of the industrial street, as if they had been patiently waiting for this exact moment to arrive. Marcus Sterling loudly cursed, aggressively pushing Clara behind the heavy metal frame of the laundry truck as bullets wildly sparked off the asphalt all around them. Kill every single one of them, Marcus shouted to his men over the deafening noise, but keep the girl alive. The bloody battle that immediately followed was incredibly brief, but shockingly vicious. Clara pressed herself tightly against the massive rear wheel of the truck, desperately covering her ears with her trembling hands to block out the terrifying sound of automatic weapons tearing through the damp air. She could hear grown men shouting, screaming in agonizing pain, and dying just feet away from her fragile hiding spot. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, an eerie and suffocating silence fell heavily over the blood-stained street. Clara, a desperate, gravelly voice called out through the lingering gray smoke. She looked up slowly to see Julian Thorne running frantically toward her, his handsome face locked into a mask of cold, murderous fury she had never witnessed before. Fresh red blood heavily spattered his crisp white shirt, and he gripped a smoking handgun tightly in his right hand. Directly behind him, Silas and 6 other ruthless enforcers were already busy securing the chaotic area, standing victorious over the lifeless bodies of the rival crew. Marcus Sterling himself lay completely motionless near the black sport utility vehicle, his dead eyes staring sightlessly up at the turbulent storm clouds. Are you hurt? Julian demanded, dropping his weapon to the ground and pulling her roughly to her feet. His large hands frantically moved over her pale arms and trembling shoulders, checking for any hidden injuries with a desperate, frantic thoroughness that took her breath away. "Did they touch you? Did he hurt you?" "I am fine," she barely managed to choke out, her entire body shaking violently from the adrenaline and the pure terror. "Julian, I am fine." Before she could say another single word, his strong arms were wrapped tightly around her, completely crushing her against his solid chest with a raw desperation that defied all logic and reason. She could easily feel his heart hammering wildly against her ribs, and she could feel the undeniable tremor in his large hands as he buried his face deep into her dark hair. "You could have been killed," he whispered against her skin, his voice incredibly raw and thick with unhidden emotion. "They could have taken you, hurt you, and I would have burned this entire city to the ground trying to find you." The horrifying reality hit her right then, striking her chest harder than a physical blow. It was not just the terrifying realization that she had nearly been kidnapped by a brutal rival syndicate, but the sudden, sickening understanding that Julian had been following the laundry truck the entire time. That this whole bloody shootout had been a carefully orchestrated trap, with her serving as the helpless, dangling bait. "You already knew," she gasped, placing her hands flat against his chest and violently shoving him backward. "You knew I was going to try to escape in that truck." His powerful arms did not loosen their possessive grip around her waist. "I have known since Sunday night. Martha came to my office crying, and she told me all about your little conversation regarding the delivery schedule." A blinding wave of betrayal and hot rage flooded instantly through her veins, choking her with its intensity. "You purposely used me as bait. You let me walk completely blind into a deadly ambush just to draw your enemies out into the open. I protected you," he fired back fiercely, his dark eyes flashing with intense possessiveness and undeniable conviction. "I had skilled snipers positioned on every single roof on this street. I made absolutely sure you were never in any real danger." "Never in any real danger?" she screamed, shoving his chest hard enough this time that he finally had to release her. "There were bullets flying absolutely everywhere around me. Marcus could have easily put a bullet in my head before your men even fired a single shot." "Marcus is dead," Julian stated coldly, gesturing carelessly toward the bloody corpse lying on the pavement. "His threat to our lives is permanently over. You are completely safe now." "Safe?" She spat the word out like it was literal poison on her tongue. "I am just your helpless prisoner. I am trapped in this horrifying nightmare because you are far too obsessed to let me live my own normal life." Her voice cracked heavily with pure fury and overwhelming desperation, the tears she had been fighting finally spilling over her lashes. "I hate you. I hate this violent world. I hate that terrible house, and I completely hate what you have done to me." Something painful flickered deep within Julian's dark eyes. It looked briefly like genuine hurt, or perhaps a sudden, devastating understanding of how completely he had broken her fragile trust. But when he finally spoke again, his voice was as still and cold as a frozen lake in the dead of winter. "Then hate me," he said quietly, closing the distance between them until he was staring directly down into her tear-filled eyes. "Hate me all you want, Clara, but you are never leaving my protection again, even if I have to forcefully protect you from your own foolish decisions." As Silas and the remaining armed men silently loaded her back into a heavily armored car to return to the estate, Clara realized with a sinking certainty that her failed escape attempt had only made her desperate situation infinitely worse. She had just shown Julian exactly how incredibly far she was willing to go to leave him forever, and now he would personally make absolutely sure she never got another chance to run. For 3 excruciating days following the bloody ambush, Clara refused to speak a single word to anyone. She sat perfectly still by her bedroom window, staring blankly out at the sprawling grounds that had officially become both her sanctuary and her eternal prison. Martha brought lavish meals that went completely untouched. Silas aggressively checked the perimeter security with cold, mechanical efficiency. And Julian kept his agonizing distance, though she could constantly feel his heavy presence like a dark shadow lingering at the very edge of her awareness. The overwhelming grief hit her in suffocating waves, not just for her lost freedom, but for the entire normal life she had painstakingly planned. She was supposed to graduate in exactly 2 months, She was supposed to start her social work internship at the local community center, and she was supposed to help foster children who had grown up neglected and broken just like she had. Instead, she was permanently trapped in a terrifying world of violence and dark obsession. On the evening of the 4th day, Julian finally came to her room. "You desperately need to eat," he said quietly, settling into the velvet chair across from her untouched dinner. He looked incredibly exhausted, with dark purple circles under his eyes and rough stubble shadowing his sharp jaw. For the very first time since she had known him, his perfect, terrifying composure seemed genuinely cracked. "Why?" she asked softly without turning away from the rain-slicked window. "So I will have the physical strength to be your compliant prisoner?" Something painful in his tone made her finally look at him. The cold Mafia mask was completely gone, replaced by something that looked almost like raw regret. "I know you hate me," he continued, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "And maybe you absolutely should, but please hate me alive, Clara, not dead." She desperately wanted to stay angry, wanted to fiercely hold onto the burning fury that had sustained her for the past 3 days, but sitting there looking at his quiet desperation, she felt something heavy crack deep inside her chest. "I had plans," she whispered, the tears she had been fighting finally spilling over her cheeks. "I was going to work with neglected kids who grew up in the foster care system just like I did. Kids who desperately needed someone to believe in them. Now what am I? Just another helpless casualty of your violent world." Julian remained completely silent for a very long moment. "Show me," he said finally. She stared at him in pure confusion. "Show you what?" "Your plans. Show me exactly who you were before you accidentally met me." An hour later, Clara found herself sitting cautiously in Julian's private study, pulling up the website for the Sunshine Children's Home on his massive computer monitor. Despite her lingering anger, she felt her genuine passion returning as she nervously explained her internship ideas for support groups, job training, and college preparation for teens aging out of the system. As she talked, she noticed Julian making careful notes on a legal pad, his dark eyes intensely focused. "Come with me tomorrow morning," he commanded softly, setting down his pen. "I want to show you something important." The very next morning, they drove in total silence through the impoverished south side of Chicago in an unmarked black sedan, with Silas following at a discreet distance. They finally stopped at a nondescript brick building with a simple wooden sign that reads St. Catherine's Home for Children. "Why are we here?" Clara asked as Julian gently led her up the crumbling front steps. "You will see," he replied cryptically. Inside the building, absolute joyful chaos ruled. Dozens of children ranging from 5 to 17 years old filled every available space, doing homework, playing board games, and laughing loudly. The walls were painted in bright, cheerful colors, though the furniture clearly showed its extreme age. Mr. Thorne, an older woman in her 60s, hurried over, her tired face lighting up with genuine joy. "We certainly were not expecting you today." Sister Margaret happily gave them a grand tour, and Clara slowly began to understand the stunning truth. The brand new computer lab donated anonymously last year, the fully renovated industrial kitchen, and the generous college scholarship fund that had successfully sent 12 at-risk teenagers to university had all come directly from Julian. "Your mysterious benefactor has been an absolute godsend," Sister Margaret was saying with tears in her eyes. "Without his financial support, we would have permanently closed 2 years ago." Julian remained perfectly silent, but Clara saw the undeniable way his dark eyes softened completely when the little children happily ran up to greet him. She watched in stunned silence as a tiny girl with braided pigtails fearlessly hugged his long legs, and how the ruthless Mafia boss crouched down to patiently listen to a teenage boy awkwardly explain his science project. On the quiet drive back to the estate, Clara stared at him with entirely new eyes. "How long have you been financially supporting that place?" she asked softly. His large hands tightened slightly on the leather steering wheel. 8 years. When she quietly asked him why, he did not answer for several city blocks. Then, his deep voice barely a whisper, he finally spoke. "Because I used to be exactly one of those forgotten kids. The raw confession hung between them in the small space of the car like a fragile bridge. That night, Julian found her standing alone on the mansion balcony, wrapped in a thick blanket and staring up at the dark stars. He approached slowly, like she might bolt if he moved too fast, and settled against the stone railing beside her. "My parents died when I was 7 years old," he confessed into the darkness, close enough that she could feel his radiating warmth. "I spent 5 miserable years bouncing between abusive foster homes and overcrowded group facilities until the syndicate found me and taught me that ruthless power was the only thing that kept you safe." Clara found herself intensely studying the sharp lines of his face in the pale moonlight, remembering how his strong hands had violently shaken with pure fear for her safety during the alley shootout. "You are not the terrifying monster I expected," she admitted softly, suddenly feeling incredibly self-conscious. Monsters do not run secret charities, and they do not remember that a little girl likes her pancakes shaped like butterflies. His dark eyes dropped slowly to her lips, then back up to rise. "Maybe I am just a monster who desperately wants to be better for you." The absolute honesty in his raspy voice made her breath catch painfully in her throat. Without even thinking, she stepped closer, drawn by a magnetic pull she could no longer deny. He reached up slowly, gently cupping her face with hands that could easily kill, but he touched her like she was made of the most precious spun glass. "Clara," he whispered, and her simple name on his lips sounded exactly like a holy prayer. When she looked deep into his dark eyes, she did not see a ruthless captor anymore. She saw a broken boy who had learned to hide his kindness behind violent efficiency, and she saw a man who was just as hopelessly trapped as she was. The heavy moment stretched endlessly between them, full of dangerous possibilities, until a harsh buzzing from his cell phone violently broke the spell. Julian stepped back, the cold Mafia mask sliding instantly back into place as he answered the call from Silas, leaving Clara alone on the balcony to wonder when everything had become so terrifyingly complicated, and when she had started wanting the man who had stolen her freedom. Silas stood quietly in the deep shadows of the underground parking garage, his cold blue eyes locked straight ahead as heavy rainwater drummed violently against the concrete ceiling above him. He pressed his encrypted cell phone tightly to his ear, his rigid jaw clenching and unclenching as he listened to the raspy voice of Marcus Sterling's former top lieutenant on the other end of the line. "Are you absolutely sure about this, Silas?" the surviving rival asked, his thick Brooklyn accent dripping with obvious suspicion. "Once we make this move against Julian, there is absolutely no going back for any of us." Silas tightened his heavy coat against the damp Chicago chill. "I have never been more sure of anything in my entire life," he replied, his gravelly voice completely devoid of any hesitation. "Julian has completely lost his legendary edge. That nobody college girl has made him incredibly weak and dangerously reckless. If this current situation continues, our entire criminal syndicate will be completely dismantled, and we will all be dead within a year." The rival lieutenant let out a low whistle of disbelief. "And you honestly think betraying your own boss will magically save your organization?" Silas watched the dirty rainwater cascade down the dark concrete entrance of the garage, his mind violently flashing back to the horrific bloody ambush and the pathetic way Julian had desperately clung to Clara in the aftermath. "I firmly believe that permanently removing the fatal distraction will ultimately save what is left of the great man I have blindly followed into hell for 10 years, Silas stated coldly. "Marcus actually had it right the very first time. She is his ultimate weakness, but Marcus was far too impatient and incredibly sloppy." The lieutenant remained quiet for a tense moment before demanding to know exactly what Silas was proposing. "You take the girl," Silas instructed, his voice as steady as a stone, though his thick hands shook slightly with the monumental weight of his treason. "Keep it perfectly clean and incredibly quiet. Make it look exactly like an outside retaliation job for Marcus. Once she is permanently gone from his life, Julian will finally remember exactly who he really is, and if he comes aggressively hunting for your crew, he will never know that it was actually me who orchestrated the entire thing. I will personally help him hunt for her, and I will feed him nothing but false leads until the trail goes completely cold." By the time he finally realizes the horrifying truth, it will be far too late to matter. The rival lieutenant let out a dark, cruel laugh that echoed through the phone speaker. "You are literally asking me to start a massive war with one of the most terrifyingly dangerous men in the entire city of Chicago." Silas closed his eyes, sealing his terrible fate. "No, I am specifically asking you to help me save him from himself." After ending the treacherous call, Silas sat alone in his idling car for a very long time, staring blankly at his own hardened reflection in the rear-view mirror. He had been Julian's fiercely loyal right-hand man for a solid decade, had physically pulled him out of more deadly firefights than he could ever count, and had freely bled for the empire they built together. But the past month had changed absolutely everything he thought he knew. Julian was consistently making highly emotional decisions, taking wildly unnecessary risks, and literally turning their entire multi-million-dollar operation into a paranoid fortress completely centered around protecting one insignificant girl. It simply had to end tonight. 2 floors above the dark garage, Julian stood silently staring out his massive office window, a very strange, suffocating unease settling heavily in his broad chest. Something felt incredibly wrong in the air, not quite wrong enough to firmly identify, but constantly present like a low-frequency hum buzzing at the very edge of his sharp consciousness. He had just finished carefully reviewing the weekly perimeter security reports when Silas knocked sharply on the heavy oak door. "Come in," Julian commanded without turning away from the rain-slicked window. Silas entered with his usual rigid military bearing, but something deeply subtle in his posture seemed suddenly different to Julian, perhaps slightly more tense, far more formal than their usual brotherly dynamic. "Boss, I strongly think we should seriously consider moving the girl immediately," Silas said without any preamble, his face an unreadable mask of perfect stone. "My deepest sources heavily suggest there is still dangerous chatter echoing on the violent streets. Marcus's people have not all been fully accounted for yet, and they are out for blood." Julian finally turned away from the window, his dark eyes instantly narrowing with protective concern. "What exact kind of chatter?" "Nothing highly specific," Silas lied smoothly, offering a casual shrug of his broad shoulders. "Call it my gut instinct. This massive estate has been her home for far too long, and predictable patterns eventually make easy targets." For a long, tense moment, Julian deeply studied his oldest friend's scarred face. Silas was completely right. They had definitely gotten far too comfortable here, and Julian knew that his growing, undeniable feelings for Clara had absolutely clouded his normally flawless judgment regarding strict security protocols. "Where exactly would you suggest we take her?" Julian finally asked, unwittingly walking directly into the deadly trap. "The secure safe house located in Lake Forest," Silas replied instantly, without missing a single beat. "It is incredibly remote, perfectly secure, and only 3 of us even know its hidden location." Julian nodded his head slowly, sealing their violent destiny. "Set it up immediately. We move her there tomorrow night." "Already done," Silas replied coldly. "The armored transport will be fully ready at exactly 10 o'clock. After Silas quietly left the quiet office, Julian simply could not shake the lingering, terrible feeling that something was horribly off, completely unaware that the man he trusted with his life had just signed both of their bloody death warrants. The violent attack came at exactly 2:15 in the morning. Clara jolted awake to the terrifying sound of automatic gunfire echoing loudly through the secure Lake Forest safe house. Blinking rapidly in the sudden darkness, she watched as emergency lights bathed her unfamiliar bedroom in a harsh red glow, and she could hear heavy boots and men shouting frantic orders in the grand hallways below. Her solid oak door violently burst open, making her scream, but it was Julian who appeared in the doorway. His dark hair was wildly disheveled, his crisp white dress shirt partially unbuttoned, and he held a heavy black handgun tightly in his right grip. "We need to go right now," he commanded, rushing across the room and grabbing her bare arm to pull her roughly from the warm bed. "There has been a massive breach." Clara stumbled over her own feet, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "What is happening? Is it Marcus's people?" "It is far more men than we ever expected," Julian replied, his voice tense as he already began moving toward the large window, expertly scanning the manicured grounds below. They are already completely inside the inner perimeter. A deafening explosion suddenly shook the entire foundation of the building, and white plaster rained down heavily from the cracked ceiling onto their shoulders. Looking past him through the shattered window, Clara could clearly see bright muzzle flashes lighting up the pitch-black darkness like deadly fireworks. "This way," Julian ordered, pulling her away from the glass and leading her quickly toward a hidden wooden panel in the hallway wall that she had never even noticed before. He pressed his palm against a scanner, and the panels slid back silently to reveal a very narrow, steep staircase leading straight down into the pitch-black bowels of the house. "This is an emergency exit," he explained rapidly, pushing her gently but firmly ahead of him. "It leads directly down into the underground garage. We have an armored vehicle waiting." They had made it exactly halfway down the suffocatingly tight staircase when the red emergency lights suddenly flickered and went out completely, plunging them into absolute blinding darkness. In the terrifying blackness, Julian's large hand found hers, squeezing her cold fingers with a desperate, crushing tightness. "Stay incredibly close to me," he whispered harshly near her ear. "Whatever happens down there, do not let go of my hand." They finally emerged into the cavernous concrete garage only to find absolute bloody chaos. The lifeless bodies of Julian's trusted security men lay scattered brokenly across the cold concrete floor, and the damp air was incredibly thick with gray smoke and the acrid burning smell of gunpowder. Standing perfectly still near the open exit ramp was Silas, surrounded by 5 heavily armed men Clara did not recognize, all of them pointing their lethal weapons directly at Julian and Clara. "Silas," Julian's deep voice was barely a rough whisper, profound disbelief and agonizing betrayal fiercely warring in his shocked tone. "I am so incredibly sorry, boss," Silas replied, his scarred face a cold mask of grim, unbreakable determination. "But you truly left me absolutely no other choice." "You treacherous son of a bitch," Julian roared, his protective instincts overriding everything else as he rapidly raised his weapon to fire. But one of the rival intruders was much faster and fired first. The echoing gunshot was deafening in the enclosed space. The heavy bullet caught Julian cleanly in his left shoulder, violently spinning his large body around and sending him crashing heavily into a thick concrete support pillar. "Julian," Clara screamed at the top of her lungs, desperately trying to break free and run to his bleeding body, but strong, cruel hands instantly grabbed her arms from behind, painfully yanking her backward. "No permanent damage," Silas coldly ordered the trigger-happy shooter, his blue eyes entirely devoid of any mercy. "He needs to live with this agonizing loss." Julian stubbornly struggled to his knees, dark red blood streaming heavily down his arm and staining his white shirt, his handsome face violently twisted with raw physical pain and murderous rage. "Do you honestly think doing this will save me?" Julian gasped, clutching his bleeding shoulder. "Do you think taking her away from me will magically make me stronger?" Silas took a slow step forward, looking down at the man he had served for a decade. "I firmly think it will finally remind you exactly who you really are." Silas gave a sharp nod to his armed men. "Take her to the vehicle right now." "Silas, please, you cannot do this." Clara frantically fought against her brutal captors, kicking and thrashing wildly, but they were far too strong for her. "You do not understand. Taking me will not help him. This will entirely destroy him." "Maybe," Silas said quietly, completely unmoved by her desperate tears. "But it will also permanently save what is left of our dying organization." As the ruthless men dragged her forcefully toward a waiting black van idling near the exit, Clara heard Julian violently roar her name with the primal, earth-shattering fury of a deeply wounded animal. The horrifying sound echoed through the smoky garage like a blood-soaked promise of pure vengeance, and she knew with absolute certainty that whatever noble outcome Silas mistakenly thought he was accomplishing tonight, he had actually just signed all of their agonizing death warrants. The heavy metal doors of the van slammed shut with a sickening finality, entirely cutting off her tragic view of Julian as he tried desperately to crawl across the blood-stained concrete toward her despite his severe wounds. As the van tire screeched and drove rapidly away from the burning safe house into the stormy night, Clara realized she was not crying for her own lost freedom anymore. She was sobbing uncontrollably because she had finally understood exactly what Julian Thorne truly meant to her, just in time to watch him bleed out on a cold garage floor. In the smoking, blood-stained ruins of the underground garage, Julian Thorne knelt in a dark pool of his own blood and made a silent, lethal promise that would violently shake the Chicago underworld to its very foundations. Silas had truly believed he was saving their criminal organization by forcefully removing a dangerous distraction. Instead, the treacherous right-hand man had just unleashed something far more terrifyingly dangerous than a mafia boss in love. He had successfully created a ruthless monster with absolutely nothing left to lose. Miles away, the abandoned industrial warehouse smelled strongly of decaying rust, stale sweat, and shark fear. Clara had been tied securely to a heavy wooden chair in the exact center of the cavernous, echoing space for what felt like agonizing hours. Her pale wrists were rubbed completely raw from the coarse rope, and her aching head pounded rhythmically from whatever chemical they had used to keep her sedated during the rough transport. The newly appointed leader of Marcus Sterling's surviving crew paced restlessly in front of her like a trapped, paranoid animal, his scarred face twisted with mounting frustration and undeniable dread. The remaining dozen members of the rival syndicate nervously lounged around the perimeter of the damp warehouse, but their supposedly casual postures did not hide the rising, suffocating tension clearly visible in their darting eyes. They all knew exactly what was rapidly coming for them. "He's going to find me," Clara said out loud, her voice remarkably steady and strong despite the cold terror viciously clawing at her tight chest. "And when he finally does, every single one of you is already dead." The rival leader stopped his frantic pacing and violently backhanded her across the face. The sharp, sickening crack echoed loudly through the quiet warehouse, and warm metallic blood immediately trickled down from her split lip. "Your obsessed boyfriend is not coming to save you, princess," the man snarled viciously, leaning in close so she could smell his foul breath. "He is probably bleeding out on the concrete floor of that fancy safe house right now." Clara stared directly into his cruel eyes without flinching a single fraction. "You do not know Julian at all. Hurting me will never make him weak. It will only make him entirely unstoppable." "We will certainly see about that," the man spat back. But even as he desperately tried to project false confidence, Clara could easily see the cold, creeping doubt heavily infecting his panicked expression. Frantic radio reports had been rapidly filtering in all morning long. Julian was systematically hitting every single known safe house, brutally interrogating every corrupt ally who had ever done illegal business with Marcus's fractured organization. Mangled bodies were rapidly piling up across the entire city, and every single bloody death brought Julian one step closer to this exact warehouse. 3 agonizing hours later, the very first violent explosion powerfully shook the concrete building. Julian had moved relentlessly through the warehouse district like the Grim Reaper himself, leaving a terrifying trail of dead bodies and burning buildings entirely in his chaotic wake. His left shoulder was absolutely on fire, where the heavy-caliber bullet had violently torn through dense muscle and bone. But the excruciating physical pain meant absolutely nothing compared to the suffocating agony of knowing Clara was trapped somewhere in this dark maze of concrete and steel, terrified and completely alone. He had already violently hit 6 separate locations, forcefully extracting critical information from anyone who might possibly know where the traitors had taken her. Some cowards talked immediately, while others stupidly required severe persuasion. Absolutely none of them survived to regret their brief association with the traitors. The 7th warehouse sat quietly at the very end of a dead-end street, heavily surrounded by rusted shipping containers and abandoned vehicles. It looked completely empty and entirely unremarkable, which made it the absolute perfect place for hiding a high-value hostage. Julian coldly studied the fortified building through his sniper scope from 3 blocks away. There were 2 armed guards stationed at the main entrance, at least 1 hidden sniper positioned on the flat roof, and probably a dozen more heavily armed men waiting inside. It was a fortified stronghold, but it was certainly not an impregnable one. He had brought 12 loyal men with him, the only trusted enforcers he could entirely rely on after Silas's devastating betrayal. They moved like silent ghosts through the decaying industrial wasteland, flawlessly positioning themselves around the target warehouse with deadly military precision. Lighted up, Julian commanded coldly through his earpiece. The brutal assault immediately began with a series of controlled, deafening explosions that violently blew out the massive warehouse windows and instantly plunged the dusty interior into screaming chaos. Thick gray smoke grenades quickly followed, rapidly filling the cavernous space with blinding clouds that aggressively turned visibility to absolute zero. Clara heard the rival men frantically shouting panicked orders, heard heavy boots violently scrambling for defensive positions, and heard the terrifyingly distinctive mechanical sounds of automatic weapons being readied for a bloody battle. But through all the horrific noise and blinding smoke, she actually found herself smiling through her bleeding lip. He had come for her exactly like she had known he would. The intense gunfight that immediately followed was incredibly brief, but shockingly vicious. Julian's hand-picked men were cold professionals, highly disciplined and perfectly coordinated. The rival crew were just desperate street thugs, highly dangerous but entirely undisciplined. The final outcome of the bloody siege was never truly in any doubt. When the thick gray smoke finally began to clear from the air, Julian appeared silently through the lingering haze like a dark, blood-soaked avenging angel. His expensive clothes were violently torn. His handsome face was heavily streaked with black soot and drying blood, but his dark eyes burned with a cold, terrifying fury as they instantly found her tied to the chair across the ruined warehouse. "Let her go," Julian called out, his deep, commanding voice echoing ominously through the quiet space. The rival leader desperately emerged from behind a rusted shipping container, his hands shaking violently as he held a heavy gun directly to the back of Clara's head. "I do not think so, Thorn," the panicked man replied, his voice cracking with pure fear. "You on her back? You are going to have to go through me and everyone I have got left." What happened next was exactly like watching a devastating force of nature violently unleashed upon the earth. Julian moved with inhuman speed and flawless, lethal precision, his heavy weapons becoming seamless extensions of his own destructive will. He flowed fluidly through the obstacle course of the warehouse like running water, instantly adapting to every single remaining threat. One by one, the last standing men violently fell to the concrete floor. Some frantically tried to run for the exits. Some stupidly tried to stay and fight. Not a single one of them made it out alive. Finally, it was just Julian and the trembling rival leader facing each other across the bloody warehouse floor, while Clara watched silently from her chair, still securely bound but no longer afraid of anything. "You brought this entirely upon yourself," the leader stammered, raw desperation heavily creeping into his breaking voice. "You stupidly chose some nobody girl over your own criminal organization, over the loyalty of your own men." "I probably chose love over fear," Julian replied softly, his gun raised perfectly steady and aimed directly at the man's chest. "And you unfortunately chose the wrong side of a war you could never possibly win. She will never be safe." The man spat out his final, venomous words. "There will always be someone else in the city who sees her as your ultimate weakness." Julian's smile was infinitely colder than a harsh winter storm. "Then let them all come." The final gunshot echoed loudly through the cavernous warehouse like a deafening crack of thunder. The rival leader crumpled instantly to the blood-soaked concrete, his eyes already glassy and vacant with sudden death. Julian rapidly holstered his smoking weapon and ran frantically to Clara, his large hands shaking violently as he quickly untied her corsets. The very second she was completely free, she threw her arms tightly around his neck, entirely ignoring the fresh blood, the thick smoke, and the horrific violence that heavily surrounded them. "I honestly thought I had lost you forever," he whispered brokenly against her dark hair, his normally composed voice completely raw with overwhelming, unhidden emotion. "Never," she whispered fiercely back, feeling hot, stinging tears she did not even remember shedding streak rapidly down her dirty cheeks. "I am not going anywhere, Julian. As police sirens began to wail faintly in the far distance, Julian effortlessly lifted Clara into his strong arms and carried her safely toward the warehouse entrance. Behind them lay the broken, lifeless bodies of absolutely everyone who had foolishly tried to tear them apart. Ahead lay an entirely uncertain and dangerous future, but they would boldly face it together. The secondary safe house located far outside the city limits was absolutely nothing like Julian's massive estate, just a highly secure, modest two-story home hidden at the end of a long wooded driveway where curious neighbors did not exist to ask unwanted questions. Clara sat curled tightly on the plush living room couch, a thick wool blanket wrapped securely around her trembling shoulders, silently watching Julian pace the length of the hardwood floor like a caged, wounded animal. He had barely spoken a single word during the 3-hour drive from the blood-soaked warehouse, his rigid jaw clenching with the intense kind of heavy tension that only comes from painfully holding back words that might permanently change absolutely everything. Now, in the complete safety of 4 walls and bulletproof windows, those desperate words were violently fighting their way out. "I need to tell you something," he finally said, stopping abruptly in front of the unlit stone fireplace. His broad back was turned to her, his shoulder stiff with whatever heavy burden he was about to confess. When he finally turned around to face her, Clara was genuinely shocked by what she saw. The cold, perfectly controlled Mafia mask was entirely gone, completely replaced by a raw, devastating vulnerability that instantly made him look incredibly young and entirely human. "I need to tell you the real reason why I kept you," he whispered, his deep voice cracking slightly. Her heart clenched painfully in her chest. "Julian, please, you do not have to say this right now. Let me say this, Clara. You deserve the absolute truth." He walked slowly over and sat heavily on the wooden coffee table directly in front of her, close enough to feel her radiant body heat, but strictly not touching her. "That very first night when you accidentally scratched my car in the rain, I could have easily let you go. I could have simply taken your insurance information and completely forgotten you ever existed. Then why did you not let me go?" she asked softly. "Because for 30 seconds in that dark alley, you looked at me like I was just a regular man. Not a terrifying boss. Not a monster to fear or blindly obey or use for money. Just a person." He looked down at his own blood-stained hands. "Do you have any idea how incredibly rare that is in my violent world?" Clara instinctively reached out for his hands, but he gently pulled back. "I stubbornly told myself that I was protecting you, that keeping you locked up close to me was the absolute only way to keep you safe from my many enemies. But that was a selfish, pathetic lie." He stood up again, beginning to pace the room. "I kept you prisoner because I was incredibly selfish and because the thought of losing you felt exactly like dying. Silas was completely right about one thing. I did become weak. I started making reckless decisions based entirely on blind fear instead of cold logic. Fear of losing you. Fear of what would inevitably happen to me if you ever left." He stopped pacing and looked directly into her eyes. "I turned you into a helpless prisoner because I was far too much of a coward to simply ask you to stay." The heartbreaking words hit her like physical blows, not because they were cruel, but because they were completely true. "I never once gave you a real choice," he continued, his voice heavy with self-loathing. "And that is not true love. That is just toxic possession." Clara felt hot tears sliding rapidly down her pale cheeks, but she did not even know if they were from profound sadness or overwhelming relief or something else entirely. "So, I am giving you that choice right now." Julian walked over to a small table by the window and carefully picked up a set of silver car keys and a thick manila envelope. "There is a fueled car waiting in the garage with completely clean license plates. The envelope has a massive amount of untraceable cash and a brand new identity for you. A new driver's license, a new social security card, a new passport, absolutely everything you need to completely disappear." Her breath caught sharply in her throat. "What exactly are you saying?" "I am saying that you are finally free, Clara." The painful words seemed to physically tear something apart deep inside his chest. "You can walk right out that front door tonight and never see me again. You can safely go back to school. You can finally get your degree. You can help all those foster kids you desperately wanted to help. You can live the normal, beautiful life you planned before I selfishly destroyed it. And what about you? She asked, her voice breaking. His sad smile was entirely heartbreaking. I will personally make absolutely sure no one ever comes after you again. I have enough remaining enemies to keep me completely busy without creating any new ones. Clara stared blankly at the shiny keys resting in his outstretched hand, her exhausted mind reeling out of control. This was exactly what she had desperately wanted from the very beginning. Her freedom, her old life back, the precious chance to freely choose her own path. All she had to do was reach out, take the silver keys, and walk away forever. What if I do not want to go? She whispered softly. Then you are not thinking clearly. His voice was incredibly gentle but entirely firm. Clara, my dark world is built entirely on violence and death and constant, terrifying danger. You have personally seen exactly what happens to innocent people who get too close to me. Is that really the kind of life you want? She thought quietly about the bloody warehouse, about the brutal betrayal of Silas, about the dead bodies scattered across Chicago simply because she existed. She thought about the pure terror and the red blood and the constant, suffocating knowledge that tomorrow might never actually come. But then she thought about the colorful orphanage on the south side, about the terrifying Mafia boss crouching down low to patiently listen to a little child science project. She thought about his strong hands shaking violently when he held her tight after the ambush, about the beautiful way he had whispered her name like a holy prayer on the moonlit balcony. You are completely right, she said firmly, watching his handsome face begin to crumble with impending loss. Your world is incredibly dangerous and violent, and sometimes entirely terrible. She stood up slowly, dropping the heavy blanket and walking toward him with absolute, unbreakable purpose. But your world is also exactly where you are, she continued, her voice growing much stronger with every single word. And you are the man who sees incredible potential in throwaway kids. You are the man who perfectly remembers that I love my pancakes shaped like little butterflies. You are the man who is fully willing to start a massive, bloody war just to get me back. Clara, please, he begged softly. I spent my entire life feeling completely invisible, she said, now standing directly in front of him, close enough to feel his rapid heartbeat. I lived with foster families who never really saw me. I had teachers who quickly wrote me off as a lost cause. I lived in a world that taught me every single day that I was never worth fighting for. But then I met you. You looked directly at me and you saw something totally worth dying for. She reached out and gently took the silver keys from his trembling hand, and for a fleeting second, his dark eyes filled with absolute despair. But then she deliberately turned and tossed the keys carelessly onto the table behind him. I do not want a safe life, she said, reaching up to gently cup his scarred face in both of her hands. I do not want an easy life. I only want you. You do not know what you are truly saying, he whispered, his hands moving hesitantly to her waist. I am saying that I choose this violent life. I choose you. I choose us. She smiled radiantly through her flowing tears. Not because you are forcing me to stay. Not because I am too afraid to leave. But because standing right here beside you is exactly where I finally belong. When he leaned down and kissed her, it was exactly like coming home and starting a terrifying adventure all at the very same time. His strong arms came completely around her with a desperate, crushing reverence, securely holding her like she was the single most precious thing in his entire world. Because she finally was. We can never go back to the way things were before, he promised softly against her lips. If you truly stay, if we actually do this, you are my absolute equal partner in everything. Equal choices, equal risks, and an equal say in exactly what happens next in this empire. I swear it on my very life. As they held each other tightly in the quiet safety of the hidden house, both of them knew perfectly well that the dark road ahead would be anything but safe. There would certainly be dangerous new enemies, terrifying new challenges, and deadly new threats waiting around every single corner. But they would face every single one of them completely together, a broken boy who had finally learned how to truly love, and a lost girl who had ultimately found her forever home in the absolute most unlikely place. And sometimes, that powerful kind of love was more than enough to completely change the world. Well, that is the end of Clara and Julian's wild story, and I really hope you enjoyed this journey with Sunni romance. But I have to ask, would you have taken the car keys and run, or would you have stayed to rule the Mafia empire?